In chapter 9, we're going to be looking at genetics and how traits are passed along, dominant traits, recessive traits, and things like that. So you can see some different traits here. We've got height. If you look at the middle picture, some people can roll their tongue, some people can make special twists with their tongue, and some people can't. And this is based on genetics. The color of animals, a lot of times, it's going to be passed on. Sometimes will have mutations to cause things like albinos, but it's all going to be based on genetics. And so I always like this meme here. So genetics, basically, you have some traits from dad, some traits from the mom, and you're going to get a combination of those. First of all, if we look at all of these different dogs, I want you to think about which two you would say are most alike. And so we're going to then look at the DNA sequence of some of these dogs. Now, maybe the Labradoodle and the Toy Poodle you think are most alike, or the Gray Wolf and the Coyote. So let's take a look. Everyone's going to have a genetic sequence of these bases that we looked at in the last chapter. So if we look, these are a small segment of the genetic code for these different animals. And it starts here and continues on basically 3 rows for all the different dogs we're looking at. For the most part, they look very similar if you look straight down and you compare. Every once in a while, maybe you'll notice a difference. But let's highlight some of those. So you can see on this base, the red fox has a difference. Here, the Labradoodle. On this section, 305 to 380, it looks like the red fox has more differences than any others. And again, on the second section and third. So the red fox is the most different from all of these. We can see here on this section, the red fox and that coyote have a very similar pattern. And so just by comparing DNA sequences, we can see similarities and differences between different species. So genetics, we're looking at the science of how genes are determined, how they're passed from one generation to the next, and how those might change along the generations. So remember, we're looking at the DNA that's found in the nucleus. We're looking at on a single chromosome, we're going to find all of those different bases. So your traits are going to be different characteristics: eye color, hair color, how tall you are. Um, are you more susceptible to certain diseases or not? You're going to get 2 alleles, one from the mother and one from the father, for every trait. Now, some traits, it takes more than one pair of alleles to determine what that trait is going to be, but you're going to get one allele from mom and one allele from dad to help determine what your traits are going to be. Gregor Mendel is the scientist that is most famously known for his work in genetics. He was actually a monk, and we have watched a little video about him. We're going to talk a little bit more about what work he did. So he's considered the father of genetics, and he worked with pea plants. And so he spent much of his life working with these pea plants. And he came up with 3 different rules. So one is the law of dominance and recessiveness. One is the principle of segregation and the principle of independent assortment. And we're going to talk about those as we go. But basically, those are going to be the guiding rules of how genetics would be determined. So why did he choose pea plants? Basically, he said they were very easy to obtain, they grew pretty quickly, and they were easy to take care of, and they grow real well. Now, one thing he you have to note with flowers, the sexual reproduction of flowers it's going to be with the pistil and the stamen, and so they have to be pollinized for offspring to be produced. Now, he had to have what are called true breeding plants. And what this means is when these plants produce offspring, they're always going to produce this exact same type of trait. That way, he knew what offspring to predict. If you have a pea plant that sometimes would produce green or sometimes would produce yellow, then that wouldn't be true breeding. It would always have to produce, let's say, green peas always and 100% of the time to be considered true breeding. So he would cross pollinate different plants. He would pollinate them with like a little paintbrush himself so there wouldn't be any accidents of maybe a bee pollinating and crossbreeding plants that he didn't have control of. So he took that on himself to actually pollinate the plants. One thing that we have to look at, we're going to be talking about different generations. So pea generation is going to be considered the first generation of, in this case, peas that you will be crossing. F1 generation would be the P generation's children, and then F2 would be F1 generation's children. So you maybe think of the P generation as the grandparents, the F1 generation as the parents, and then the F2 as the kids. So you could think of your grandparents, your parents, and you. Hybrids are considered the offspring of the parents that have different traits. So, something you can try if you place your hands like this, some people naturally put their hands with the left thumb on top, and some people with the right thumb on top. And so, you can try that. Ask your family members what feels most natural and see if that's something that's common in your family. So, for Mendel's experiments, he first started with the height of the plant. So he had true breeding tall plants and true breeding dwarf plants. So he crossed these plants, and every time he crossed them, he always got tall plants, tall plants produced from the true breeding tall and the true breeding dwarf. So this made him wonder what happened to the trait that created the dwarf plants. And so after that, he thought, well, that trait must be lost somehow or hidden or masked. Where did it go? So we know that these are called genes. He called these factors of what is being passed from one to the next. We know these are called genes. And the alleles are going to be the different forms of that gene or that trait for each type. So you could either have tall or dwarf. He tested all kinds of different things on these pea plants: the shape of the seed, the pod shape, the different colors, different flowers and heights, all kinds of different things. And he always found out the same thing would occur. One trait would always dominate over the other, would always show up over the other. And so this is called the dominant trait, and the trait that was hidden or masked that you didn't see in the offspring is called the recessive trait. So he wondered, okay, so what's happening to that recessive trait? Where is those dwarf plants, where are they going? What's happening to that? Why can't we produce this? So then he took the F1 generation and he crossed those to see what he would get. And when he did that, 3/4 of the time he would get tall plants, and then 1/4 of the time he would actually get a short plant. And so then he ended up crossing the F2 generation, and he was able to see what happened with those. Now, one thing we need to remember when we are having um, sperm and egg cells be produced, these traits are passed along on the chromosomes. So we're going to use T as the trait for tall and short. So big T is going to represent a tall plant, a little t represents a dwarf plant. So each parent is going to start out with two because they got one from their mom and their dad. During meiosis 1, those are doubled and then split, and then in meiosis 2, those are split again. So each of the 4 sperm or 1 egg and 3 polar bodies, these are going to be passed on to the offspring. So there's a 1 in 4 chance for each allele that they're going to get. If they get a big letter, that means they're getting the dominant allele. If they get a little letter, they're getting the recessive. Sometimes you will have the parent will only pass big letters, the dominant. Sometimes they will only have recessive. It just depends on what their own genes are. When we have two alleles that are the same, that's called homozygous. And when we have two that are different, that's called heterozygous. So this would mean homozygous for the dominant trait. You have two capital letters, they only can pass along the dominant, or homozygous for the recessive, they can only pass along the recessive trait. And this one, heterozygous, means they can pass either one. They've got both of the alleles. When we're looking at what's called genotype and phenotype, genotype means what letters or what types of alleles does the individual have. Phenotype means what do they actually look like, or what's the actual trait that they have. So if someone has two big T's, then in this case, they're going to be tall. If they have a big T and a little t, well, if they have a big one at all, they're going to be the dominant trait, so tall. If they have two littles, then they would be a dwarf plant. So when we're looking at genetics or probability of producing offspring, we're looking at how likely is it for that trait to show up. So we're going to use Punnett squares, and you might have done this before. So the two alleles for the first parent are going to go on the top, and then the two alleles for the second parent are going to go on the side. Now, what I've done in all of our homework and things like that, I've put the father on the top and the mother on the side. It's not really going to make a difference, but just for our purposes, we're going to put the father alleles on top and the mother on the side. Then, when you go to cross these parents, so the father has a big T and a little t, so you would put straight down a big T, and straight down little t. And then the mother has big T across, and then one in each box. So this shows 4 possible alleles. So if we look at the offspring for these two parents, now the father in this case would be a tall plant, but it carries that trait for the dwarf. And the mother plant would be homozygous for tall. They're going to produce two homozygous tall and two heterozygous tall plants. So if we looked at here, in his first cross of those pea plants, he had a true breeding tall and a true breeding dwarf. When they were crossed, you can see the only thing that was produced was heterozygous, which means all of them would have shown up tall. And this is why they didn't see any dwarf plants in that F1 generation. And so the genotype for that would have been 4 out of 4 big T little t, and 4 out of 4 or 100% would be tall. When he then crossed the F1s, the big T, little t's, then can get out of the four to be the dwarf plant, and that's what he saw. So we've got one is big T, two of the four are big T, little t, and the last one fourth is the little t, which would mean 3/4 are tall, 1/4 are dwarf. So let's give this a try. So here we've got dimples as our trait. Dimples are dominant over no dimples. So we're going to say that dimples will be a big D and no dimples will be a little d. We're going to cross heterozygous man. So that means he's going to have a big D and a little d because he's heterozygous. With a woman does not have dimples. So if she doesn't have dimples, that means she has to have little d, little d. So now for the man, we're going to cross down his big D's and then his little d's. And for the woman, we're going to go across. So little d, and then this one, little d to little d. So what genotypes do we get? We got big D, and we got little d, little d. So 2 of the 4 were this, and 2 of the 4 were this. So what are the phenotypes? So for these, that means they would have had dimples, and then the other 2 would not have had dimples. Let's look at another one. All right, so the last thing here, normal skin is dominant over albino. So again, you can pick any letters that you want, but try to pick letters that are easy to tell the difference between the capital and lowercase. C's are sometimes hard, O's are sometimes hard. So for skin, S's can be hard too. So we'll do normal for our dominant, and recessive we'll do little n. Okay, so normal is dominant. Woman who has normal skin, but her father was albino. So if she has normal skin, she has to have at least one big N, right? If her father was albino, albino means that they have to have too little. So if her father has too little, she had to get a little from the father. She marries a heterozygous normal skin man. Heterozygous automatically tells you they have one of each. What offspring might they expect? So let's cross. So we'll bring down the male first, and then the female. You always want to put the capital one first if you can, if you have the option. And then little. Okay, so what genotypes did they get? They got big N, and they've got one of those, 1 out of the 4. They got big N, and that was 2 out of 4. And then they got little n, 1 out of the 4. So what are my phenotypes? Well, we know it's normal skin versus albino. And how many normal skin did we get? 1, 2, 3 out of the 4. And albino, we got 1 out of the 4. So the questions at the bottom, how many different genotypes are possible? Well, we got 3 possible. How many different phenotypes are possible? Well, either normal or albino, so that would be 2. What is the probability of getting homozygous offspring? Homozygous just means they have 2 of the same letter. So this would be homozygous and this would be homozygous. So 2 of the 4 would be homozygous. And then the probability of getting heterozygous would be the other 2 out of the 4. What is the probability of getting normal offspring? We said 3/4, and getting albino is going to be 1/4. All right, so those are single trait crosses.